How you going? Like the other day when I said I'm feeling a bit iffy about posting this, that was nothing. I feel quite concerned about what I'm doing tonight, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? I think what I have to say tonight is probably pretty important, and if you're going to watch any of my things, this is the one that I really want you to pay attention to. I'm just going to do it. So, look, we've talked about a lot. I've talked about, just recently I've talked about symptoms of PTSD. You know, hypervigilance, quick to anger, zero tolerance to frustration, that sort of stuff. The range of responses that are likely to things like PTSD, look, as many people as there are, that's probably as many responses as there are to this thing that we are calling PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's traumatic stress, right? So I'm going to try to stick just to the military tonight, but it is applicable across the board. One thing that really irks me is when people make broad generalizations about who can and who can't, who shouldn't and who should have symptoms consistent with a formal diagnosis of PTSD. If I hear people saying, oh, they can't have PTSD, or they can, or they can't, or they shouldn't, it makes no sense. If I hear people saying that sort of thing, all I hear is, I don't know what I'm talking about. Because you don't. You should stow it. If you don't understand what it is you're saying, and if you're saying that you clearly don't, you probably should be quiet and educate yourself. Go and find out, because you sound ignorant. Too strong? No, it doesn't sound too strong. It's the facts, right? So I'm moving into difficult terrain tonight. That's all right. Life begins in low range, right? Low range, first gear all the way. Pick a path. I'm going to do it. So what does it mean when people say things like, you don't actually have to see active service in the genuine sense of the term as in you see combat, or you see trauma directly and you're involved in it directly? What does that mean? What I'm getting at is what may affect me a lot and stick with me and continue to affect me in the future may not affect you anywhere near as much or at all. Similarly, a seemingly inconsequential incident or event might affect me even more than something that is serious and probably should affect me a lot. What? So I'm diving right in. Actual risk versus perceived risk of what? Actual risk of what? Actual risk of death, violence, near death, likely death, bit of death, injury, serious injury to you, to your mates, to others. The perception of helplessness, horror, That risk of that, actual exposure to that, yes, those things. Being directly responsible for the loss of life, being directly or indirectly responsible for the loss of life, one or the other, sometimes both. Those things, risk and actual exposure to or perceived risk to it. What about if you get deployed and you don't see any actual combat? Are you allowed to say that you got PTSD? Yes. Yes, you well are. You are. Because you're working under a day-to-day environment every single day where you are likely to have contact with the enemy. You are likely to come into contact with life-threatening situations, experiences to you or others. You are likely, and yes, you have been deployed, so you are likely to do those things. And if you are on alert, like we talked about, if you are elevated, like we talked about, for an extended period of time, like we talked about, you don't actually need the actual thing to occur if you've been exposed to it for a long period of time as a risk of it occurring. You're there, you said yes to being there in this instance, in this context. So you're prepared to have it. So actual involvement in war fighting directly doesn't necessarily lead to PTSD. It does for some people. Being deployed to those circumstances without the actual exposure directly, for some people, can lead to PTSD. That intense sense of exposure, of risk, is what it takes. So if you don't have control of a situation, if you have a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, or horror of impending death or really serious injury, it can lead to PTSD. So remember though, look, we're all on a scale. Some of us are going to be more likely to develop PTSD than others. Some people get a level of PTSD from events that most of us wouldn't even look at sideways. And then there are those people who are exposed to a god-awful amount before something clicks and they end up with some symptoms of PTSD. And no, it doesn't take combat to develop this stuff. You could be lots of things. I guess the main thing I'm getting at is that if you think you can say, well, someone should or shouldn't, probably should be careful. So, an active participant in a situation can often fare better. What does that mean? It means that you can go and actively patrol to seek out and close with said enemy and engage that enemy and come out better, PTSD-wise, than someone who does not get the opportunity to exercise their skills for real. You have a level of active engagement you are able to do. And yet some other people in the same circumstances are going to have an issue. That's okay. What about someone who is behind the wire, for all intents and purposes, generally safe, but they're in a bunker and rockets are coming in? They have no control. There is no element of do for them apart from sit tight. That part can actually be more difficult than being an active participant in an encounter. If you don't have that sense of control, it can make it worse. For some people, not everybody. And so I guess that's the point tonight. The point is probably convoluted, but it's real business. Why do I say it's real business? Humour me again. I've only asked you one time to do that before. What if you get deployed and you don't have what other people see as a legitimate reason or cause for having these symptoms because you were not actively engaged during your deployment? What if you're that person and yet you've got PTSD? Legitimately. Leaves you in a situation where your team, broader community, might negatively assess your mental health as being a bit soft, which is just such bollocks. It leaves you in a situation where you are struggling genuinely for real reasons, but you can't ask for help. So you're kind of stuck. Do you speak up about this, what for all intents and purposes might be a non-issue, in terms of genuine risk and that you were exposed to something for real, actual, or do you keep it to yourself because other people are going to likely say, well, what are you worried about? That was just nothing anyway. When I. It leaves a person who deserves support, who deserves every single amount of understanding that people can give to get them through this thing. I guess what I'm saying is that anyone who's out there saying anything about this can't possibly lead to PTSD should be quiet, because you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that's why this discussion is so important. If you've had an experience that bothers you, I don't care if it's actual combat or it was perceived risk or something that really probably shouldn't matter in the big picture, but it does bother you. Come and talk to me. Find someone to talk to. Get it sorted. You are just as deserving as the next person with this thing. Long post. More to say. Tim.